human beings and our civilization is amazing in so many ways, but can be destructive in so many ways. And the same species can give their life up for somebody that they love, sometimes even a stranger, jump in front of a bullet to protect a child who's being shot at, go into the line of fire in a distant, far off foreign country to fight in a war, dying for people that you don't even speak the same language as because you want to protect them. Human beings are capable of that. Human beings are also capable of immense atrocities as well. And it's this duality and this difference in which we kind of live in that I have so oftentimes have problems with, because you feel as though sometimes those people that are on death row are not human, are not the same thing as you or I. These people that are serial killers that kill people just for fun, they can't be human. They're subhuman. And many of us would like to think that because we wouldn't want to associate ourselves with that we could never be that. Unfortunately, every single serial killer that is locked up currently and has ever been locked up is the exact same thing that we are. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think it's important to understand and to know how great we can be, how friendly and welcoming we can be to one another, giving up our lives for one another. Because once you know how awful and how terrible we can be, that's when you can then utilize your goodness and whatever you have left of your goodness for good. Because there are stories just like the one that I'm about to share of humans using, in the face of just pure destruction and hell on earth, using whatever they have to try and comfort, spread good, spread joy, be protectors. And hopefully this story will kind of bring home this idea of that humans are both. Humans are both amazing creatures, but humans are both, or humans are also creatures in which there is immense destruction and a probability of total annihilation. This is the tragic ordeal of the Berlin Zoo in World War II. I'm going to read this for you. Khalid El Hassan, May 10th, 2019. The Berlin Zoo's baptism of fire occurred during an RAF air raid on September 8th, 1941, when it was struck by half a dozen 100-kilogram bombs. The stables in which the cattle were housed caught fire from incendiaries, and a forest-themed restaurant in the surrounding area sustained damage. All in all, however, the damage was relatively light, especially compared to what was to come a few years later. Repairs were completed within a few weeks, and the zoo was soon back in business, as if nothing happened. The zoo was not hit again during the next 2 years, other than for 5 100-kilogram bombs that struck some empty space between the wolves' enclosures and the cattle pastures. Then, catastrophe struck in November of 1943, when Arthur Harris, the head of RAF Bomber Command, launched the Battle of Berlin, an attempt to win the war by reducing the German capital to rubble and destroying the Luftwaffe in the process. The effort failed, but Berlin suffered heavy damage before Harris acknowledged that, and the bombings were tapered off. By then, The Berlin Zoo had been wrecked. The worst damage was sustained on the nights of November 22nd and 23rd, 1943. On the 22nd, over 250 RAF heavy bombers struck western Berlin, including the Tiergarten district in which the zoo is located. During a 15-minute stretch that night, starting at around 7:15 p.m., numerous high explosive bombs and more than 1,000 incendiaries rained on the Berlin Zoo, blasting and setting alight many animal enclosures, including those housing the elephants, monkeys, and predators. Firefighters were unable to contain the blazing infernos as the city's water mains had been broken by bombs. Within a quarter of an hour, almost a third of the zoo's animals had been killed. It was not over, however. The RAF returned the following night for another heavy raid. And around 8 p.m. on November 23rd, the zoo's aquarium was completely demolished when a stick of bombs scored a direct hit, killing most of its inhabitants, blasting and scattering them far and wide. The following morning, pedestrians making their way along the nearby Budapestris were greeted by the startling sight of crocodile bodies on the street, their carcasses having been flung there by the blasts. Such episodes gave rise to frightful rumors that some dangerous animals had escaped the zoo, alive, and were prowling Berlin streets in a maddened state. Stampeding elephants were said to be running amok amidst the city's rubble, while tigers were supposedly stalking the streets, slaughtering and mauling all they came across. As with most rumors, the stories were greatly exaggerated. Some potentially dangerous animals did escape their enclosures, but almost all were chased down and killed within the zoo's confines. The only animals that made it out of the zoo were a dingo that was recaptured, plus some monkeys and birds. This is within the zoo. Anti-aircraft gun. Demolition and recovery. Making things worse for the Berlin Zoo's animals was the nearby zoo tower, one of the massive concrete towers brimming with anti-aircraft guns that sought to protect Berlin from Allied bombers. Picture the distress felt by pet dogs or cats when fireworks go off, and multiply it by orders of magnitude to get an idea of what the Berlin Zoo's residents must have gone through. The caged denizens were forced to endure the roar and drone of heavy bombers overhead, the shrieks, explosions, and concussions of the detonating bombs, the ensuing smoke and fire and dust, and the rapid cracks and booms of the flak guns firing away. Many of the zoo's animals went insane from fear, and others died outright from terror. Among the casualties of the November bombing raid were 2 giraffes, 2 hippos, a black rhinoceros, a sea elephant, and half the deer and antelopes. Out of 8 elephants, the only survivor was a bull named Siam, who exhibited signs of psychological trauma until his death in 1947 from natural causes. Meat being scarce during the war, the dead animals were butchered to feed the staff and the teams of soldiers and prisoners of war who were put to work clearing the rubble. And I want to take a moment and just look at this image right here, because this image right here is exactly what I'm speaking about. Humans are complicated. Humans are a weird creature. In the face of such destruction and annihilation and death and despair and bombs and fires and people being shot, you have this woman here feeding in a makeshift room. Look at the floor of this place. Look at the walls of this place. Look at the state of the bathtub. Look at the state of the piping, of the walls, of the sink. This was hell on earth. And yet, in this picture, the caption reads, Shoebill, temporarily housed in his Berlin zookeeper's home as the Red Army stormed into the German capital in 1945. This woman is opening up her home, what's left of it, to these animals at the zoo, showcasing that while humans are dropping bombs and trying to kill as many people as possible, destroy as much of the city as possible, we have people such as this woman who is using her time to deliver sustenance to these animals, possibly some food that she would have used to feed herself or her family. But she's using it to give to this animal. It's complicated. It's weird. Let's continue reading. As one of the Heck brothers put it, quote, we had meat coming out of our ears. Many of the edible animals which had fallen victim to the air raid ended up in the pot. Particularly tasty were the crocodile tails. Cooked tender in big containers, they tasted like fat chicken. The dead deer, buffalo, and antelopes provided hundreds of meals for man and beast alike. Later on, bear ham and bear sausage were a particular delicacy. The bombing raids of November 1943 were not the end of the zoo's ordeal, as it was struck again and again in subsequent months by explosive bombs, incendiaries, and aerial mines. In 1944 alone, it was hit on January 29th and 30th, February 15th, March 4th, May 8th, numerous times in October, and on December 31st. It was struck again on February 24th, 1945. Despite the damage, the Berlin Zoo remained open almost to the end, not closing its gates until April 22nd, 1945, as the Red Army stormed into the city. What little had been left of the zoo was completely destroyed in the ensuing battle. Among the few survivors was a shoebill bird, whose keeper took it home and somehow managed to keep it alive as Berlin was systematically destroyed in bitter street fighting. Another survivor was a baby hippo named Natchki that had miraculously made it through the raids of November 1943. When some boys braved the fires, engulfing its shelter to help it escape into a nearby pond. Natchki survived the war and became a darling of the public when the zoo reopened. He went on to sire 35 offspring before he died decades later in 1988. Today, a life-size sculpture of Natchki stands at the entrance to the Berlin Zoo's Hippo building. History's weird. And I just want to keep this image up. This was less than 100 years ago. This is many people, especially if you're in your 30s or 40s, your parents, especially your grandparents, remember this. They lived in this world of confusion. Because on one side, you have these people who work at the zoos who are not involved in the war. They're not soldiers. They're not fighting. They're going to their job at the zoo to provide for these animals. And without them, the animals die. Then you have other humans who their goal is to defeat the enemy, to drop bombs on this city, to take it over. And you have these two clashes between them, which they don't know that they're really fighting against each other. The bombers are not trying to take these people out per se. They're just trying to destroy the city as much as possible so that they can come in and take it over. And these zoo people are hoping that these very same people are not dropping bombs on their particular location. You could drop bombs a couple streets down, but not on the zoo. Not where these animals that I care so much for that'll go into a burning sanctuary, a burning environment where I could potentially lose my own life to save a hippo, to save an animal that many would believe that if you were out in the wild, the hippo wouldn't think twice. It would eat you right then and there. It's such a weird place to be as a species where we're capable of these two things, of immense love and of carefulness and sacrifice ultimately for these beings that in many cases would not reciprocate it, wouldn't think twice about trying to save us. But that's the species that we are. But we're also a species that drops bombs on these places, that tries to inflict as much harm and as much damage as possible, to kill as many people as possible, to end bloodlines, to end family trees, to destroy the legacy of families who have lived in this particular city for decades, if not hundreds of years in this particular area of the earth. That's the ultimate cost of war. It burns a family tree to the ground, erases it from the history books. Some of these families, they had no offspring that survived after them. They're done. They're gone. They're not coming back. That family's DNA is not getting passed down to 2023, much less 2020, much less 2000, much less 1950. And you have all of this craziness and death and destruction, and still these people are able to find a way to provide for another species that isn't them. This is one of the stories that I came across on Instagram, and I mean it perfectly encapsulates the duality of our species, of the greatness on both sides, the greatness of love and compassion and sacrifice that us humans can exhibit, but also the great destruction and savagery that we can also exhibit as well. Interesting article. Interesting article.